Hi, I'm Chloe, business owner and director, and I'm here at Druces with Caroline.
Hello, I'm Caroline Cropley. I'm head of corporate restructuring at Druces, which is the City of London law firm.
Brilliant. Well, let's get started. So it's been well reported that the economic climate has been quite challenging for businesses. What trends are you seeing, for example, with expansion of businesses at the moment?
It's really interesting, Chloe, because at the moment we've got lots of really exciting opportunities and new tools that are available to businesses to help particularly small businesses, for example, ramp up their businesses but without actually having to expand their staffing base. So you can have a situation where a small business has a presence globally by way of their website and also enables tech to help them to do things that they would otherwise need a team for. So it's very exciting in that sense. And in terms of expansion, we've got an opportunity to potentially do business in geographically larger reaches. And also from staffing perspective, you've got an opportunity to recruit from a bigger pool of talent because of the trends from working from home a little bit more. So it's very interesting times at the moment.
But I imagine that also comes with some challenges in terms of keeping teams feeling cohesive and staff morale and things like that when you've got people based in different geographic locations.
Exactly. So there's lots of benefits from working from home because a lot of employees obviously want a lifestyle that's better suited to their family life as well as home life. So there's lots of good opportunities available, but however, with that comes risk. So you've got situations where you've got a scattered workforce, confidential information potentially being used in homes, so potentially not being controlled quite so tightly by the businesses as they would have done previously. And you've also got situations where you haven't got as much visibility on the staff, so you're not always sure entirely what they're doing and how they're working in terms of efficiency. So that all has to be carefully monitored. And we have also got to bear in mind the fact that there's team spirit there when you go into the office, and when you're all in different locations, it's very easy for employees to sometimes get a bit left behind and perhaps not be exposed to the learning opportunities that they would have in the office.
And when it comes to the tech and the development of tech and AI, what challenges but opportunities are we also seeing there?
So AI is interesting, and I think it's presenting loads of opportunities for the businesses to actually do things super quick and very, very well. In terms of the actual use of the applications, it would always be recommended to make sure that you're using a local application, particularly if you're using confidential business information or information that has confidential client information on it. If you don't do that, then the risk of data protection and leak is massive, and you have to be very, very careful in relation to the data protection legislation. The fines are huge. There's pressure to get more fines in, and additionally, you've got a situation where you could have a huge reputational damage to a business, which can actually destroy businesses. So it needs to be used very carefully. And if you're at all unsure, I would always advise getting legal advice on those contracts to make sure you know exactly what you're getting into in terms of rights and obligations and what they expect from you in return.
And then when we're looking at the wider economic climate, how are the costs impacting businesses at the moment?
So everything seems to be going up, and in the press we're often seeing lots of situations where there's lots of stories about how terrible the climate is, and we all know there are issues and there are tensions in the world stage at the moment. Businesses, it can be a difficult time for them. So the board of directors needs to be very careful to make sure they monitor very closely and very frequently finances, because it doesn't take that much for a business to go off the rails, and it's helpful to take the temperature of the business by checking the finances on a regular basis and ensuring, with all the use of tech and things that are available, that the financial statements are still easily understandable and presented in a way that the board can get to grips with and understand.
So what would your top tips be for any businesses trying to navigate the terrain at the moment? For example, do you have anything for future-proofing businesses?
So for top tips in relation to businesses, my first recommendation would be to be proactive rather than reactive, which I think is extremely important, particularly in this environment. So make sure that you know what the law is, particularly I'm thinking of employment legislation, which is about to change radically, and potentially exposing your business to more risks and liabilities if you're not on top of that side of things. And additionally, in relation to data protection legislation, which is ever evolving and, as we've already discussed, can carry huge liability and also massive reputational damage. So my top tip would be to make sure that you are proactive, not reactive, and that you have a good understanding of the legal terrain within which you're working.
And are there any implications with that when it comes to, as we spoke about earlier, having employees in different regions and different countries?
It's really interesting because with the scope to be more geographically international in terms of business, in terms of clients, customers, and also employees, we have to be more careful in with regard to the different jurisdictions and laws that are at play. So whilst you might have a business based in England, if it's doing business in different countries, then we need to be very careful that we're not inadvertently breaching any laws of different countries. And that's where a good legal team can help you. Even if you have an English legal team here on the ground, then they will usually have a team in terms of international contacts that they can pull in to help in relation to advice on the ground in these different jurisdictions. So we at Druces have lots of contacts in different international jurisdictions, and we can project manage through the London office in terms of any international advice that's needed.
Big help to businesses, I'm sure. When it comes to intellectual property rights, is there any advice or guidance you can give there? I know we've touched on things like AI and that in the past.
So intellectual property rights are a very strange concept because a lot of them are very tangible. It's not like having stock in a warehouse. So they can often carry great value for a business, and obviously a business's brand is worth a lot in terms of the goodwill and the business itself and how it positions itself. And often a lot of money goes into developing these things. So it's extremely important for businesses to ensure that they know that where the legal title to those assets are. So, for example, if you have a third party helping you develop an app, make sure that the contract makes it clear that the title belongs to your business. Or you might want to take some advice in relation to putting it in an SPV if it's a new venture, for example. And I'm sorry, SPV is special purpose vehicle, so a new entity, a new corporate entity that might want to hold the IP separately. And I would always take legal advice around the structuring of those types of situations. So yes, IP, intellectual property rights, make sure that you know where the legal title is sitting and you understand where it is before there's any issues. Equally, make sure that you're protecting your rights. Often to protect rights, they need to be registered. So make sure that you're taking legal advice on that, and make sure that once you've got that legal advice, if you see that any businesses trying to encroach on those rights, that you enforce quickly and swiftly to stop any damage to your goodwill of the business.
And I imagine it's quite important as well to make sure with your teams and your staff that it's really clear where those intellectual property rights lie as well. Absolutely.
So, for example, if staff are developing intellectual property rights as part of their employment, it needs to be very clear in relation to what is expected in relation to those property rights and where they sit. So yes, that's very important, especially because of the value that they can actually attract and the use for the businesses. Equally, I've seen situations where a license to use intellectual property rights has been so important to a business that when that license has been terminated, it can be catastrophic. So they need to be able to be very clear on the grounds on which they're using the rights and the ownership if they intend to own them.
So you mentioned SPVs. Would you like to go into a bit more detail about that?
Yes, so if a business is starting out on a new venture, it's sometimes quite helpful to put that new venture into an SPV, which is a special purpose vehicle, so separate it from the main business. And that's useful in terms of liability because often, with the best will in the world, new ventures, they're very exciting and there's lots of opportunities, but they have to be carefully managed to make sure that they grow correctly. And sometimes there are risks associated with it. So sometimes it's helpful to isolate it into a separate vehicle so that it's away from the business. And if there are any issues in the new terrain that you're venturing into, it doesn't affect the main business.
So when we're looking at early warning signs, what are the ones that businesses or board members are often overlooking at the moment?
So I'm a lawyer, so I focus mainly on the law, but I think financial statements are really, really important because they effectively take the pulse of the business. So my advice to any business would be to make sure that the board of directors have very easy to understand but comprehensive financial statements and that they monitor them regularly. Because it doesn't take long for a business to suddenly dip in terms of its financial performance. And if issues are identified early, so again, proactive rather than reactive, then advice can be sought at that stage to make sure that everything is done to enhance the business's position as possible. So, for example, it may be that there's a restructuring element to it, or it may be that something just needs a bit of a more careful eye. So my advice would be make sure that the board of directors have full and comprehensive information in a readily understandable format. Otherwise, the situation for directors, whilst companies have limited liability, it is slightly there is an element of personal liability which can attract to directors if they don't act in accordance with their duties towards the company. So that often comes into play if a company goes into an insolvent situation. So to help protect the directors against personal liability, they need to make sure that they are acting in accordance with these duties and making sure that they take their position seriously and monitor the risks and act appropriately. This also plays into what we spoke about earlier in relation to directors and not delegating too much with regard to the business. With all the amazing opportunities available, make sure that the board of directors still keeps its finger on the pulse.
And then when it comes to preparing those financial statements and making sure they're nice and easy to understand, there could be a risk that people feed it into AI to make it more digestible, more understandable, but I imagine that comes with some risks as well.
Exactly, and we all know that there are lots of different ways to look at things through different lenses. So it's important that the information presented at board level is balanced and clear and gives a true and clear impression of the business, so that the board of directors have the best possible information to make their decisions, to base their decisions on. And I would advise that no matter what financial situation the business is in, that the board of directors are readily available to have board meetings at really short notice. So whilst it may not be needed, if there is an emergency and something needs to be actioned quickly, that they are available to do that. Again, tech helps with that because we've now got the opportunity to have virtual board meetings. So that is obviously beneficial in those situations.
And then when it comes to businesses that have been set up by family or friends, are there anything that need to be put in place to make sure that relationship not only works from the beginning, but continues to work throughout the life cycle of the business?
Exactly. So family and friends, often people do go into business with family and friends, and they always start off with the best of intentions. And often these businesses are very successful. But there are situations which we see in the office where they've come to us because there's been a situation where they've fallen out or their views on how the business is to proceed differ. And we're having to untangle the arrangements that they put in place between them. So it's usually a really good idea to have what's called a shareholders agreement, which I like to refer to almost like a prenuptial agreement, to agree everything before anything starts, so that everybody is very clear on what their roles are and very clear on what happens in relation to the running of the business and what's expected of them. So once that's agreed, these types of documents can also contain dispute resolution mechanisms, which can be so helpful if there is a dispute and we've got a situation where we're trying to run the business, or the client's trying to run the business and also deal with the dispute in the background, which can waste huge amounts of management time, also legal costs at that stage. And also it's not great in terms of stress for the businesses. So I would always say, again, be proactive rather than reactive. Get a good shareholders agreement in place. It doesn't cost a huge amount of money, but it can be worth so much in terms of alleviating problems if there is a dispute in the future. It's also helpful, to think about that in terms of future generational planning. So in terms of keeping the shares in the family, for example, and what would happen if a shareholder died unexpectedly and how the business continues, especially if they're a key person in the business.
So proactivity has really been the theme throughout, but what difference can having the right legal partners from day one make to a business?
So I'm a corporate lawyer. So corporate lawyers often project manage matters for their clients. And I have clients who I've worked with for many, many years, and I've seen them grow and develop across the years, which is a wonderful side of my job. So in terms of having a team in place, I would always say it's a relationship. So you need to make sure that the team that you choose in relation to your professional advisors is one that you enjoy working with and that understand your business. So the longer you work with the team, the more they can understand about your business and understand what the pressure points are, what the personal objectives are, and they can tailor their advice much more accurately rather than if you're giving them a call when there's a crisis and you're needing a stress solution in a stressful situation. So my advice would be, it's helpful to have them in place early so they can grow with your business. It's helpful to be able to pick up the phone to a lawyer that you know who understands you and your business and can give some very quick legal advice as needed based on accurate information about the business rather than you having to explain at a situation of crisis.
And how does a business know whether it's better to have a team or a trusted partner of lawyers that they can work with, or whether it's better to have somebody in-house?
So in-house lawyers are obviously great, but it's not a luxury that every business can afford. So the way that we work at Druces is we can put together an in-house legal team for you, whereby you would often be project managed by a corporate lawyer like me, and we would identify where the other legal specialisms when we need a bit of input from another legal specialism. So you'd have one point of contact, and then we would effectively project manage as needed the other elements of the advisory as we progress through, which I think is a really nice model, and it works well with the clients that we work with on that basis.
And I imagine that works quite well because you not only have one person with one specialism, but actually you've got access to quite a few specialisms within the business.
Exactly, and it's also, in a very crude way, it's pay as you go effectively. So you've not got a situation where you've got lawyers on your books. You can just use it as and when you need it, and it's just a resource available for you to tap into as needed.
And then are there any other areas of the businesses where lawyers or legal teams can help add value?
Yes, so we've talked about earlier about the international networking and how we've got international network links through in different jurisdictions, which can be helpful. I think it's also helpful to have a trusted business advisor relationship where you can call up your lawyer and talk about issues that might be concerning you and help them take the stress away and just discuss what potential options might be available. Sometimes they see things in a different way and they can see different solutions or different opportunities that might be available to you.
So when it comes to the business owners and board of directors, are there any business issues that they're currently overlooking that you can identify?
So I think the boards of directors of businesses have a very, very important job to make sure the ship is steadied in relation to the business moving forward. So it's extremely important that they have their finger on the pulse in relation to what's going on. And as we've talked about, with expansions and staff being everywhere and contracts being all around the world, sometimes that can be quite challenging. So my advice to boards of directors would be to make sure that they have full information, clear information, and that they're monitoring it on a regular basis. It's also really important to make sure that the board of directors can come together very quickly if there's an emergency or a decision needs to be made quickly. So with the virtual reality world that we live in now, it's great that we can have virtual meetings and we don't have to physically be in the same room anymore. But equally, we need to make sure that directors can jump on these calls as needed. So I think that's important. And the reason it is important isn't just for the business, it's also important for the directors themselves, because there's personal liability that attaches to directors in the event of breach of duties that they owe to the company. So they have to be very careful to make sure that they're acting with good information, with clear information and full information, and that they're mindful of these duties as they proceed through with their decision making to avoid any potential for personal liability.
And I imagine when it comes to this information, there's a temptation to feed it into AI and software like that to be able to make it more digestible, more understandable. But I imagine putting personal information or financial information into those platforms can come with its own level of risk.
Absolutely, and as we spoke about in terms of the AI side of things, make sure that you're not putting confidential information into any processes that are effectively going to use them to disseminate around the world. So be very, very careful that you know where the confidential information is going and it's secure and it's not leaving your control. So use the local applications. In terms of how information is presented, whilst AI can present it in lots of different ways and the lens within which you look at it through can be different on different angles, it's important that it's presented in such a way that it's clear to the board and they understand what they're looking at and that they understand what the good information that they're making their decisions on.
And when it comes to that decision making and when it comes to managing those finances, where do we go in terms of things like their responsibility for debt collection and making sure the money's coming into the business?
So that's a really interesting point. So commercial contracts, again, a little bit like being proactive, not reactive. Make sure that your commercial contracts are really well drafted and that they contain good provisions in relation to debt recovery, so that if you ever have to have a situation where you're chasing debts, you've got good contractual grounding to chase those debts on, and make sure that boards are identifying and acting quickly on any debt recovery that needs to be done. So make sure that there's a clear policy in place and that things are actioned fast, because cash is king usually. So it's important to make sure that you're doing good work and that you're getting paid properly and quickly for it.
And I imagine that proactivity and having the legal counsel in place to help review those situations, that's a real benefit to businesses as well.
It's a huge benefit, and they can also advise to help make sure that any liability is limited so far as possible in accordance with the law. But also there's key provisions which can help in dispute resolution. So again, to take the stress out of those situations, if you have a well-drafted contract, it's particularly important. And again, with the international reach, it's incredibly important to make sure that you've got a clear jurisdiction clause and that you understand, if you're doing business in different jurisdictions, how that interplays with their jurisdictions, which is where a professional legal advising team would be vital.
And then there's quite a lot of businesses these days that are set up between family or between friends. What would your guidance for them be, so that with all the goodwill in the world, from day one, things are set in place properly in case business circumstances change or personal circumstances change?
Yeah, so often businesses are set up with family and friends, and they're often very successful businesses. However, there can be disputes, and when there are disputes, those are often the most dramatic kind of disputes because they feel a bit more personal. So I would always advise a business to get in place what's called a shareholders agreement, if it's a company, to make sure that they have explained clearly and everybody agrees what is expected of each of the parties in terms of the business moving forward. And also, those documents can contain dispute resolution mechanisms. So you can legislate how a dispute is going to be dealt with in the event of a dispute. So that's quite helpful. In addition, and it's often quite difficult to conceptualize these often at the beginning of a business's life, especially if it's something that isn't in the minds of anybody at the time. But for example, what were to happen if one of the shareholders were to suddenly die? It's important in those situations that the business can continue on, but equally that there are mechanisms in place to ensure that any value is properly going to where it's supposed to go in terms of the deceased estate, for example. So lawyers can help advise on what mechanisms are available to businesses and shareholders in relation to those types of situations. Particularly important if the individual is a key person in the business. So you've got a situation where obviously incredibly distressing times, but also the business has to continue on. So it helps to alleviate the stress in a very distressing situation.
So it sounds like proactivity has been a real important theme throughout our conversation today, and making sure that you've got that trusted counsel and that trusted team of legal advisors in place from day one.
I think that's very important. I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I'm trained to identify risk. So from my perspective, it will be very, very important to make sure that you are proactive, that you understand the legal arena within which you're working, that you understand where the risks are, and that you make decisions with those in mind, as well as expansion and moving the business forward. So it's a balancing act in terms of the legal advice that you're getting, but also the needs of the business moving forward. I think proactivity is really, really important because it saves not only costs, because you're not dealing with expensive litigation potentially, but it also helps to demonstrate that the board has taken their position seriously and that they're obtaining legal advice to help support the decisions that they're making. And it's a key piece of advice when making decisions. So I think, yes, proactivity rather than reactivity, and have a great team around you of professional advisors, not just lawyers, accountants, tax advisors, and make sure that they're a team that you want to work with, that you can work with, and that you enjoy working with.
Well, thank you so much, Caroline. Some really wonderful and tangible advice for businesses there, which hopefully will be of great use for people.
Thank you so much. I hope that there is something that's of interest and use to people, and it's been my pleasure. Thank you for hosting.